Why was command telling her to stand down now? Through her scope, Vanessa Reynolds had the compound in sight. The Afghan dawn trembled across her lens in waves of heat, distorting outlines, making distance a living, breathing enemy. Two men stood in the dusty courtyard below, one clutching an American hostage by the collar, the other with his thumb pressed dangerously close to a detonator. One press, one flick of his hand, and 12 Americans would vanish in a fireball that no one could stop. Her breathing slowed. The rifle pressed against her cheek, a weapon tuned so precisely it felt like an extension of her bones. Her finger hovered near the trigger. She had made impossible shots before, but never one like this. 2 lives with a single bullet, 2 threats with one chance. The voice crackled in her ear. "Hawk, this is command. Stand down, I repeat, stand down. Shot is impossible." The words were ice water. Her jaw clenched. She had heard them before, not these exact words, but the tone. The tone of men who had never trusted her hands, never believed her eyes. The same voices that told her she didn't belong here, that she was too small, too fragile, too female. And yet she had outlasted them all. She had set records that still stood unbroken. "Sir," she whispered, voice steady but edged with urgency, "they're moving the hostages in 20 minutes. This is our window." She shifted her crosshairs, her breath catching. "Let me take this shot." Silence answered her. It was the silence of doubt, of hesitation, of all the things she had spent her life proving wrong. For half a heartbeat, she closed her eyes and heard another voice, older, softer, carrying the weight of desert winds and decades of scars. "Sometimes, Hawk, you've got to trust what you feel more than what you know." She opened her eyes. The world narrowed to one point, the crease of the Jackal's neck, the exact place where bone, flesh, and fate aligned. "Let me take this shot," she repeated. And then, like the sudden crack of lightning, the story pulled backward. 24 hours earlier, the Virginia hills rang with gunfire. The sound carried across the valley like church bells, solemn, steady, inevitable. At the Advanced Sniper Training Center, Vanessa walked the line of shooters. 24 men in camouflage, prone behind precision rifles, each shot marked by a distant ping of steel or the hollow silence of a miss. She moved between them with quiet command. Dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense tie, boots crunching softly on gravel. At 38, she carried herself with a confidence carved from years of fire and failure. "Phillips," she said, pausing behind a young Marine, "your breathing's throwing you off. Exhale halfway, hold, then squeeze." He nodded, adjusted, fired. The ping came. She didn't smile, but a flicker of approval warmed her tone. "Better." At the far end of the line, she spotted another mistake. A Navy SEAL, shots drifting consistently right. "Chief Miller," she called, kneeling beside him, "your barrel's warped. Iraq deployment." His head turned, surprised. "You can tell that from my grouping." "Get it rebarreled," she said flatly. "Next time it could mean the difference between success and failure." Respect followed her down the line. It hadn't always been there. When she first took over as lead instructor at the ASTC, the men whispered. "A woman? Training the best snipers the military had. Political," they said. "Symbolic," until she had picked up a rifle, lain down beside them, and erased doubt with steel and silence. Now she trained them, the sharpest, hungriest shooters in the pipeline. She passed on what had been given to her, the art of patience, the science of breath, the marriage of instinct and calculation. But when the line went quiet and the rifles cooled, she returned to her office, and the ritual began. Her M40A6 lay disassembled on the desk. She cleaned it daily, whether it had fired or not. Every piece inspected, polished, tuned. A rifle was more than steel. It was memory. It was the weight of lives saved and taken. It was the only thing she trusted completely. The knock at her door was sharp, familiar. When she looked up, the figure in the doorway made her exhale. "Still babying that rifle, Hawk?" The voice was gravel, old stone rolled smooth by war. She smiled, rare, genuine. "Didn't know you were coming." William Harrington, Old Bill, a legend, white hair, eyes sharp as ever, and the faded tattoo of an eagle on his arm. In the sniper community, his name was scripture. To her, he was something else, the man who had seen her talent before she even knew it herself. He sat across from her, setting a battered leather notebook on the desk. Its edges frayed, its pages yellowed. Her eyes widened. "Bill." "Don't argue," he said. "Consider it a loan. You're the only one I trust with it." She touched the cover gently. Inside were decades of secrets, calculations, shortcuts, battlefield wisdom, knowledge men had killed and died for. But before she could respond, another knock came, this one less welcome. Captain Richards, the facility commander. "Reynolds," he said briskly. "Visitors, SEAL Team 8, accelerated course, 3 days." She frowned. "That's barely time to cover the basics." "They asked for our best," Richards said, his eyes flicking with hesitation. "Commander Mason leads them. He has a reputation for being traditional." Traditional. Vanessa understood the code. Traditional meant sexist. Traditional meant men who would test her authority simply because she was her. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She'd been here before. She'd prove herself the same way she always had, with results. The SEALs arrived at dawn, confident, sharp, radiating the quiet arrogance of predators who knew their worth. At their head was Commander Jack Mason, salt and pepper hair, carved features, eyes that measured everything and trusted nothing. "Captain Reynolds," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his tone polite, but beneath it she felt the question, could she measure up? "We'll start with assessment," she said evenly. "I need to see where your men stand." Mason's eyebrow flicked, but he didn't argue. His men took positions. They fired. They hit. They impressed. And when Mason suggested they didn't need fundamentals, Old Bill appeared at her side, his smile edged with challenge. "Same old Jack Mason," Bill chuckled. "Still think you know everything." Mason froze, then grinned, the respect of warriors who had once bled together. And when Bill nodded toward Vanessa, saying, "She's my finest student," something shifted in the air. Mason didn't say it aloud, but in his eyes a door cracked open. Still, cracks don't erase doubt. They only give room for proof. That night, as she cleaned her rifle again, Vanessa felt the weight of unease. Mason respected results, not credentials. His words replayed in her mind. Tomorrow she would prove herself again. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that tomorrow would not be about teaching. It would not be about wind calls and breathing drills. Tomorrow, the past she thought she'd left behind would reach out of the Afghan mountains and grab her by the throat. Because 12 Americans were already prisoners. Because the man they called the Jackal had chosen his stage. And because somewhere in that compound, among those hostages, was her brother. And as the Virginia night closed around her, Vanessa whispered the words she had spoken 100 times, but this time they tasted different. "Let me take this shot." What did respect really mean in a world where every mistake cost lives? Mason's men had been trained by the best, tested in combat, hardened in places where the weak didn't survive. Yet under Vanessa's sharp eyes, their skills looked unfinished. She stood on the range at first light, the Virginia mist clinging low to the earth. 12 Navy SEALs crouched at firing positions. Mason watched, arms folded, his expression guarded. "Your wind calls are inconsistent," Vanessa said calmly as she pointed to their groupings. "At 1,000 meters, an error of half a degree means a miss, and a miss at that distance isn't a missed target, it's a missed chance to keep your men alive." Her voice wasn't sharp, but it cut. The SEALs shifted, some hiding frustration, others quietly absorbing her words. A few still carried doubt in their eyes, the kind she had grown up with. Doubt that had stalked her since boot camp, since her first tour, since every time she walked into a briefing room and noticed the second glances her. She ignored it as always. The steel of her focus never wavered. She taught them Bill's way, the art of seeing wind like water, flowing through valleys, swirling against rocks. She made them draw patterns in the dirt, diagramming how currents shifted unseen. Wind isn't math, she told them. It's instinct. You feel it in your bones. Hours later, their shots found steel more often than not. Even Mason's hard gaze softened, his jaw no longer so rigid. Results spoke louder than reputations. Still, he approached her at lunch, voice low. My men respect proof, not lectures. Then come watch at dawn, she answered without looking up from her notes. I'll give them proof. The proof came on the long range as Bill had orchestrated. Targets at impossible distances, wind gusting from every angle. Mason's SEALs watched, curiosity edging out fatigue. Vanessa lay prone, rifle steady, heartbeat slowing. Shot after shot rang out, each ping carrying across the valley like judgment. At 1,482 meters, a moving silhouette fell. At 1,500, another target dropped. When she finally rose, her face was calm, unreadable, but the SEAL's skepticism was gone. Respect was no longer a question, it was fact. Mason extended his hand again. This time it wasn't formality, it was acknowledgement. You're better than I expected, he said. She didn't smile. That's usually the case. Bill chuckled softly at her side. Mason didn't argue. That night the phone call came. Vanessa had been reviewing ballistic charts when her secure line buzzed. The number flashing across the screen made her chest tighten. She answered, voice steady. Reynolds. Captain, came the gravel tone of Colonel Westfield. We have a situation. The words were always the same, and they never led anywhere good. Marine Force Recon, Northern Afghanistan, compromised, captured. Her spine straightened, casualties. 2 dead, 8 survivors, hostage situation confirmed. Her mind already calculated the terrain, the logistics, the layers of danger. But his next words cut through everything. One of the captured is Staff Sergeant Michael Reynolds, communications specialist, your brother. The world stopped. Michael, her little brother, the boy who used to trail her through the woods back home, asking 1,000 questions. The Marine she had warned not to follow her into this life, who had ignored her warnings because he wanted to prove himself. The man who had looked at her with pride even when she had failed. Now he was a prisoner, a bargaining chip, a target. She gripped the desk until her knuckles whitened. Her voice, when it came, was flat. What's my role? Task Force Assembly, Westfield replied. Commander Mason's SEAL team has been redirected. You'll provide overwatch support. Sergeant Major Harrington will join as advisor. Transport at 1400. Her pulse hammered. She forced the sound of it away, shoved the tremor of fear into a locked box where it couldn't control her. Understood. The line went dead. She lowered the phone, staring at nothing. The air around her felt heavier. Michael. When she turned, Mason was already watching. Your team's being redirected, she said evenly, confirming what his expression had already told her. Rescue op. Hostages, he answered grimly. My brother's one of them. For a flicker of a moment, something softened in his face. Sympathy, maybe, or respect, but his voice stayed professional. That doesn't change the mission. We'll do everything we can to bring them home, but you know the rules. I know, she said quietly. Mission comes first. But inside, her chest burned. 2 hours later, the secure briefing room hummed with tension. Satellite images glowed on the wall, a compound buried deep in the Afghan mountains. Bill sat beside her, eyes sharp as ever. Mason and his men leaned forward, silent, listening. Colonel Westfield's voice was blunt. 8 hostages, high risk, limited air support. Extraction window 48 hours maximum. Enemy leader identified Far al-Hassan, alias the Jackal. The photo appeared, one-eyed, bearded, a face carved in cruelty. Vanessa studied it with a predator's patience. memorizing, fixing every line into memory. The colonel continued. If they cross the Pakistani border, extraction becomes nearly impossible. This mission is simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Mason asked the question she would have asked. Reinforcement threats, air support limits, hostile numbers, the answers were bleak. Finally, Westfield's voice hardened. Captain Reynolds will provide overwatch. Sergeant Major Harrington, advisory role, this isn't optional. Mason's head turned sharply. With respect, sir, this team hasn't trained with her. We operate as one unit. Bringing in an outsider isn't optional, Westfield repeated. His gaze swept the room. Captain Reynolds has more experience in the Korangal Valley than anyone here. 3 confirmed high-value eliminations in that exact region, and she has personal stake. The seals shifted. Mason's jaw tightened. Personal stake meant liability, but it also meant fire. My brother's one of the hostages, Vanessa said into the silence. The words tasted like iron. The men looked at her differently then, some with sympathy, some with caution, all with new calculation. Afterward, Mason cornered her, his eyes hard. I need to know you can stay objective. She held his gaze without blinking. My brother chose this life. He knew the risks. I won't compromise your mission or your men. Bill's voice broke the tension, low but firm. She's not just another shooter, Jack. She's the shooter. Ignore that and you're blind in these mountains. Mason studied them both. Finally, he gave a single nod. Fair enough, but on the ground my word is final. Vanessa's answer came without hesitation. Wouldn't have it any other way. 90 minutes later, they boarded the C-17. The cavernous aircraft rumbled as it carried them across oceans and into the shadow of war. Mason's SEALs checked weapons with practiced efficiency, their movements fluid, silent. Bill sat quietly, weathered hands folded over his old notebook. And Vanessa? She sat with her rifle case across her knees, fingers resting on the latch. Inside was the one thing that had never failed her, her weapon, her lifeline. But tonight, as the engines droned and the men around her prepared in silence, something pressed heavier than steel against her chest. Not fear for herself. Fear for Michael. Her brother's face lingered in her mind, bruised and bleeding in some dark Afghan cell. His voice echoed the last time they spoke, when he'd laughed and told her he'd catch up to her records one day. She had smiled then. Now the memory cut her open. The mission loomed ahead, steeped in danger, layered with uncertainty. But she knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. She would make the shot, whatever it took. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. Sometimes it doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes dignity acts. And tomorrow she would act. Why did silence always feel loudest before a mission? The C-17 rumbled through the stratosphere, its engines a constant growl, its belly filled with men who barely moved. Vanessa sat among them, her rifle case strapped to her knees, her hands motionless on the latch. Around her, 12 Navy SEALs checked and rechecked gear with the precision of surgeons. Mason moved between them, his voice low, steady, a commander's presence anchoring the cabin. Old Bill sat near her, cradling a dented mug of black coffee as if the heat in his hands could ward off the cold that waited in those mountains. His white hair caught the dim red glow of the cabin lights. His eyes, though, were sharper than anyone else's. Watching, always watching. Vanessa closed her own just for a moment. She could almost hear the Afghan wind already. Dry, cutting, carrying with it the smell of stone and gunpowder. She had lived there once. She had buried friends there. And now she was going back, not as a soldier among many, but as a single piece of the plan. She opened her eyes, forcing her breathing into rhythm. In for 4, hold, out for 4. The pattern steadied her as it always had. Bill leaned close enough for only her to hear. Remember what I told you about mountain winds? She nodded faintly. They flow like water, they shift with valleys, rise before dawn, drop after sunset. Good girl, his voice was sandpaper and affection at once. Don't think, feel. She gave the smallest of nods. Words weren't necessary between them anymore. Across the cabin, Mason's voice rose above the drone of engines. 2 hours until staging. Once we hit ground, we're on Afghan time. Plan, prep, move, no delays. The SEALs nodded. No one joked, no one smiled. This wasn't the kind of mission that allowed for it. Vanessa stared at the steel floor beneath her boots and let her thoughts drift to Michael. The last phone call, his laughter, his stubborn pride. She wondered what he looked like now, bruised, chained, forced into silence. She forced the image away. In her line of work, imagination could kill. The minutes bled into hours. When the aircraft began its descent, the cabin shifted from quiet to movement. Straps tightened, helmets locked, packs hauled upright. Vanessa's grip tightened on her rifle case. The roar of the engines deepened as the wheels touched down on a runway that didn't officially exist, a strip of asphalt carved into the Central Asian dirt. The rear ramp dropped. Dust and diesel spilled into the cabin. They were in the war's shadow now. The forward operating base was little more than a cluster of tents, comms gear and watchtowers, lit faintly under blackout restrictions. The operators moved through it with silent familiarity. In the briefing tent, a model of the target compound waited: stone walls, narrow alleys, guard rotations etched into holographic overlays. Satellite feeds streamed across portable screens, each glowing figure a life, an enemy or a hostage. Mason stood at the front, jaw tight, laser-focused. "We infiltrate here," he said, tapping the map with a gloved finger. 5 kilometers from the compound. Alpha Team takes the main entrance. Bravo circles to the rear. Charlie covers reinforcements. His eyes flicked toward Vanessa. "Captain Reynolds establishes overwatch here." He pointed at a jagged ridge line, the very edge of feasible range. Vanessa studied it, already calculating angles, drop, drift. She had shot farther. She had shot in worse. But this wasn't just about distance. This was about timing. Westfield's replacement for this stage, a CIA liaison, cleared her throat. Sarah Blackwood, crisp suit under body armor, eyes as sharp as any operator. "We have an asset inside," she said. "Codename Avalanche. They'll mark the Jackal with a laser visible through thermal. If our window slips, they'll delay execution." A ripple went through the room. Assets inside compounds rarely lasted long. Rarer still were ones who could promise such precise coordination. Bill muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Vanessa. "Never trust a promise from inside. Assume nothing." She gave the faintest of nods. Blackwood continued. "The Jackal prefers theatrics. He'll stage his executions in the main courtyard just before dawn. Our intel says tomorrow. If that holds, you'll have one chance, Captain." The room shifted, every gaze landing on her. Vanessa kept her face impassive. Inside, her pulse hammered. "One shot," Mason said flatly. "No margin for error if you miss." "I won't." The words cut through the tent like a blade. Not arrogance, not defiance, just truth. Bill's faint smile answered for her. "If anyone on Earth can make that shot, it's Hawk." The silence that followed wasn't doubt anymore. It was acceptance. Mason exhaled, the weight of command pressing heavier with each breath. Then it settled. "On her mark, we breach." Night came, clear skies, stars sharp above the mountains. The Blackhawks waited on the tarmac, rotors slicing the dark. Mason's men loaded in silence, every movement practiced ritual. Bill adjusted his pack with the ease of a man who had done this too many times to count. Vanessa climbed aboard with her rifle case in hand, her jaw set like steel. The helicopters lifted, banking low over the rugged terrain. Inside, red lights cast everyone in ghostly shades. Some men prayed silently. Others checked gear for the 100th time. Mason sat opposite her, eyes fixed on her with something new. Not challenge, not skepticism, a kind of measuring respect. "First time with my team," he asked above the rotor's roar. She shook her head. Fallujah, Helmand Province, Overwatch for SEALs in both. You just didn't know it was me back then. Recognition flickered. Helmand, that was you. Ridge Line Overwatch, 37 confirmed in 3 days. Her eyes met his evenly. Yes. He leaned back, studying her as if he were rewriting every assumption he had ever made. That operation succeeded because of those shots. He paused, and for the first time his voice lowered, softer. We brought men home because of you. She didn't answer. The compliment wasn't the point. Results were. And tomorrow her results would decide if Michael lived or died. 10 minutes to LZ, the pilot's voice cut in. Instantly the air shifted. Quiet fell, the kind of quiet that comes only when men walk toward danger together. The Blackhawks descended into a valley cloaked in shadows. No lights, no markers, only the whispers of night vision guiding the way. They touched down in a swirl of dust, skids kissing rock. Doors slid open. Move out, Mason ordered. The SEALs disembarked with fluid precision, establishing perimeter. Bill followed, rifle slung casually but eyes sharp as flint. Vanessa stepped into the Afghan night, her boots sinking into soil that felt like memory itself. The Blackhawks rose, their sound fading into nothing. And then silence, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, the kind of silence that said you are being watched. They began the 2-kilometer hike. Slow, careful, noise discipline absolute. Each man placed his boots as if sound itself were the enemy. The mountains loomed like black teeth, the stars cold above them. Bill moved with surprising grace for his age, his body remembering the paths from decades past. He murmured to her once, voice low. These valleys never change. Same goat trails, same ambush points, always assume eyes are on you. She scanned ridges through her NVGs, every shadow a possible threat. Always do, she whispered back. After an hour they reached the forward hiding position, a rocky depression shielded from view. Mason gathered his leaders, maps glowing faintly under red light. Compound active. Guard rotations every 30 minutes. Hostages still inside. Dawn execution likely. His gaze shifted to her. Captain, you move to Overwatch now. Team 2 escorts to halfway point. From there you go alone. Understood. She knelt, assembling her rifle with ritual precision. Every piece clicked into place as if destiny itself had been machined into steel. Mason extended his hand once more, his face grim. On your shot, we move. She clasped his hand firmly. Wordless promises passed between them. Ramirez and another SEAL shadowed her halfway across the ridgeline before halting. This is where we split, Captain. We'll hold here until you confirm. She nodded once, then turned toward the jagged outcropping ahead, alone. The climb steepened, hands and knees clawing at stone. The night wrapped around her. Every step was a memory, every breath a reminder of the stakes waiting below. Finally she reached it, the Overwatch nest, a hollow of rock with a commanding view of the valley. She settled into it, laying her rifle across the bipod, rangefinder in hand. The compound glowed faintly through thermal optics. Heat signatures moved, guards, patrols, prisoners. She measured distances. Main entrance, 1712 meters. Courtyard, 1824. Observation post, 1435. She keyed her mic. Overwatch in position, clear sight lines to all targets. Confirmed, Mason's voice answered, calm but edged. Teams moving. 45 minutes until ready. She exhaled, her cheek pressed to the rifle's stock. Through the scope, she watched her enemies breathe, walk, laugh, smoke. They didn't know she was here. They didn't know death was already waiting for them, her finger inches from ending them. And somewhere inside those stone walls, Michael. Her brother. Alive for now. She closed her eyes once, just once, then whispered into the silence. I won't miss. Why does the tiniest sound feel like an avalanche when everything else has to stay perfectly still? She heard a twig under a boot 2 ridgelines away, and it felt like thunder. Every muscle wired to the discipline of stillness. Yet inside, a storm. Vanessa lay like a statue carved from night, cheek to stock, world reduced to glass and crosshairs. The compound below shivered in thermal whites and grays through her scope, humans as heat halos, stone as cold shadow, a courtyard that smelled to her imagination of dust and fear. Somewhere in that web of heat signatures, her brother's heartbeat was a fact she could not prove but would not stop feeling. Waiting was a profession she had practiced longer than shooting. It was a practiced boredom, a kind of vigilance that bred clarity and cruelty in equal measure. Tonight it sharpened everything, time thinned to breaths. She counted them, in 4, hold out 4. The rhythm translated to steadiness in the trigger finger, to millimeters of correction on the turret. In the radio, a whisper of movement, teams in place, overwatch clear, ETA 45. Mason's voice was a low instrument of command. Nothing decorative, nothing tender. Old Bill's voice had been a quiet hymn in her ear all evening. Feel the air more than you read the book, he'd said earlier beside the forward hide. Books teach you the how, the hills teach you the when. She didn't need his words now. She felt the valley's moods like tides, a slight lift from the northeast, a cooling that tightened the bullet's parabola, a micro-eddy caused by a crag that would push around 1/2 a degree at extreme range. Numbers lived in her head, the known and the secret, but intuition lived beneath those numbers, and it was where she trusted herself. The first order of business was a small one by comparison but essential. Neutralize the observation post on the high flank so Mason's assault could pass unseen. 2 sentries in a shallow stone hut, cigarette embers glowing like tiny stars. Close enough that the shot was feasible, but the angle would be awkward. The rock would throw shadow on her bipod, wind would bend in the thin chute above them. She adjusted for spin drift, for the Coriolis nudge at that latitude, for the subtle temperature inversion she'd seen on the scope's readouts. Target 2 in the observation post, she murmured into the calm, more a fact than a request. Mason answered in the manner of men who live by timetables. Copy, we hold. Confirm elimination on your mark. She tasted adrenaline like a metal tang. That feeling had been companion and enemy, helpful when it honed focus, deadly when it made hands shake. Tonight she had to convert it into a metronome. She held her breath until it was thin as a wire, until the rifle felt less like metal and more like an extension of the long, patient muscle down her spine. The first shot cracked, muffled through the suppressor yet still as crisp as a snapped twig. A figure slumped where the cigarette had been. For a heartbeat she watched the human form collapse, then tracked the second man as he started to pivot. They teach you to think 3 steps ahead in a convoy of lives. She had already moved her crosshairs while her first round settled. The second shot arrived before the guard finished his turn, 2 tangos down in 1.8 seconds, surgical and silent. Observation post down. 2 confirmed, she reported, and her voice did not betray the tiny flood of vindication that warmed her chest. The compound made no sound that mattered. Somewhere below, men prepared to move. Old Bill's quiet chuckle came through the earpiece like a private applause. Good and quick. Now save something for the hand that counts. She stayed wired to the nest. A sniper never relaxes instantly. She registers, she plans for contingencies. She watched for signs of alarm, dogs barking, gates creaking, men moving into new positions. Nothing yet. The Jackal's men were efficient. They had ritual. They would pause, recalculate, and then either run or give chase. The trick was to make them do neither. Her 2 clean kills at the observation post bought time, not safety. Inside that bought time, the team prepared. The SEALs tightened into their breach points like knots being pulled taut. Mason's voice was measured, each syllable meant to hold nerves in place. On my cue, he instructed. We move on the shot. The entire plan was a fuse lit against a clock. If the Jackal moved his hostages before dawn, the window would slam shut. If the Jackal sensed unusual wind or heard an odd noise, the ritual of execution might shift. They had only one alignment of moon, wind, and enemy choreography that would make the primary shot the right choice. She ran the variables again, not as a ritual but as a chain of survival. Distance to courtyard. The numbers in her scope confirmed, 1,824 meters. Observation post now obscured, roughly 1,435. Wind at her position, northeast at 5-8 knots, tending to curl as dawn warmed the valley. Temperature dropping slightly, making air denser and the bullets arc tighter, but also causing more drag over the last few hundred meters. She rotated the elevation turret, each tick a tiny prayer. The math was not simple bravado, it was honed obsession. She had spent years knowing how a 2.5-pound trigger brake felt at 1,700 meters. Tonight, 1,824 would demand every ounce of everything she had. Still, the math alone was arrogance. Bill had drilled into her the humility that must temper hubris. "Don't try to kill the impossible with numbers alone," he said once. "Sometimes the shot you take is the one the world lets you have. The rest you don't force." That line belonged to 1,000 nights and 1,000 narrow escapes, and she wrapped it around her like armor. The CIA asset, Avalanche, had promised to laser designate the Jackal when he moved for his pre-execution spectacle. An inside eye was a golden thread in a spider's web, useful but also unreliable. Blackwood's voice in briefings had been a measured calm, but she'd warned them. Inside assets are fragile things. They spoke of delay tactics, of subtle signals that might slow the Jackal's timing, giving the assault teams a fraction more margin. Vanessa stored that data and treated it like fragile glass, useful, but not something she would lean on if the bridge burned. Dawn came in a slow wash of color across the eastern ramparts, a painter experimenting with faint light. The compound volunteered its actors on schedule. A door opened and figures spilled into the courtyard, guards, lieutenants, the ritual players in this grim theater. Heat signatures flared with human movement. Through the thermal overlay, a taller signature stood out like a punctuation mark, the one-eyed man whose face had been taught to her in briefings. The Jackal. Her breath became a metronome. The world reduced to three things: the Jackal, the man behind him holding the detonator, and the tiny point where her bullet must pass through flesh, continue, and fulfill its impossible geometry. The plan they'd rehearsed in maps and models condensed into a single line of action. "Jackal in courtyard," Bill said quietly through her ear. "Looks like the bit's starting." He sounded older than his years, a man who felt the weight of memory in the valley's bones. "When he moves to center mass, you'll know it. Don't rush the moment. Let the moment find you." She listened to the radio, the soft shush of men moving into position, Mason's controlled check-ins. The SEALs tensed like spring steel. The CIA assets expected ping hadn't come yet, no laser dot, no secret flicker across her sight. She couldn't wait on a promise. She had to be ready in case the Jackal made his entrance without help, or worse, moved the hostages earlier. Time folded tight. 100 little calculations cascaded: angle of impact, residual velocity, the monstrous list of unseen physics that lived at the outer edges of a sniper's craft. She thought of Michael, not as a number but as a body in one of those heat sigs, fatigue, fear, yet alive because someone had chosen to act. That small human truth shifted the calculus from technical to moral. Shooting was always a choice. This choice carried more weight than the physics. "On your mark, Hawk," Mason breathed, a wind over the wire. The word Hawk was both identifier and benediction. It carried his trust like a chain. Her crosshair found the Jackal's neck, the seam where shoulder met taut skin. If everything aligned, the bullet would pass through that seam, first target, and continue into the chest of the man directly behind him, the hand on the detonator. It was an alignment of anatomy and trajectory so improbable that most would call it fantasy. She called it possibility. A soundless second spiraled into the open. She let the rifle cradle in the long, practiced hug of training. External noises faded until there was only the soft hiss of her own blood as it moved through her ears. She felt the wind, not as numbers but as a living thing shifting along the ridge. A faint curl to the east, correct by half a mil, compensate for rightward spin, add elevation, trust that the bullet would not betray her. She thought absurdly of the days when Michael chased shadows across the family yard, when everything dangerous was a make-believe. Dangerous then had friendly edges. Dangerous now carved whole continents into ruin. Movement below changed. The Jackal turned, a deliberate step into the light of the courtyard, his lieutenant clothes, the detonator's thumb poised. The theater of one horror began. The world narrowed until it was only the hole in the sky where a single ray of daylight licked the edge of the Jackal's collarbone. She saw it with a clarity that made the rest of the world blur. The tiny exposed flesh, the bend of the man's shoulder, the exact arc the bullet must follow. She inhaled, held, let the breath hold steady as a bridge. Her finger eased the trigger. And then silence. The radio held its breath. Mason's hands tightened on the rifle slung across his back 2 ridgelines below her. The men in the courtyard froze, all of them actors waiting for the director's cue. She did not yet permit herself to know if the world had tilted toward mercy or massacre. The moment of truth hovered between heartbeat and echo. Every fiber in her tuned for the impact that would answer whether all the math, the intuition, the training, the love for a brother, and the quiet blessing of an old man's notebook had owned this night. She thought in a small and private way of dignity, not the loud kind that demands applause, but the sort that waits until the storm passes and then straightens a collar and folds hands. If actions could be dignity, then maybe this moment would be its pronunciation. Then the tiny, impossible noise, a muffled crack, a blur, a reaction, and the valley exhaled as if it had been holding the world's breath. But what exactly had the bullet meant? Had it truly found both shapes in perfect betrayal of chance? Had the Jackal jerked and the detonator man pitched forward into death? Or had miscalculation made the line of events slide into catastrophe? The radio screamed to life with a single, sharp command. Breach! Breach now! On my mark! Mason let go the chain of command and let the warriors become what they were born to be. Men who had trained to be 3 steps ahead leapt the fence of fear and ran the choreography they had rehearsed in the dim lights of maps and briefings. She stayed glassed to the scope until the courtyard erupted. Footsteps, shouts, the metallic twang of suppressed rounds finding targets. Through the scope, movement became unreadable shapes, men crumpling, others racing for cover. Her breath finally released, not in relief but in the cool, professional sigh of a surgeon who had finished one incision before the next one called. On the line came a voice, tight and quick. Targets down, confirm, a pause. The kind that carries 100 possibilities. Then the 2 words that rewrote moments into legends and lives. Targets down. Vanessa allowed herself a tiny, almost imperceptible exhale. She had not yet heard the laughter of victory nor the hush of mourning. Both were noises she would hear in time. For now, she folded herself back into the work of watching, of choosing the next necessary action. The mountains listened. The valley answered. Somewhere below, men were moving through rubble and smoke to find the living and the dead, to collect breath and sort fate. She thought again of dignity, how sometimes it did not roar. It simply tightened a strap, offered a hand, and waited for the dawn to decide. Why does victory always arrive smelling faintly of smoke? The courtyard convulsed with motion, the sound of plans finally made flesh. Mason's teams moved like iron through water, precise, practiced, and brutal. They'd rehearsed this choreography until the choreography had teeth. Now they ran it. Doors smashed, flashbang cracks, the low, controlled thunder of suppressed weapons as they poured into the compound. Vanessa stayed behind the glass of her scope, a quiet god of distance, watching lives tilt on small mortals' choices. Her world was a circle of light and crosshair, the compound in thermal whites. Bodies moved in patterns she had seen on maps, but maps did not register fear. Maps did not show the way a man clutched another's sleeve or the way a child flinched at a noise. Through the lens she watched more than targets. She watched humanity reduced to heat and motion. She watched men throw themselves into lines of fire for reasons that were simple and sacred: brotherhood, duty, guilt, the stubborn refusal to leave a man behind. Those were the things that turned shot calls into rescue missions. On the radio came Mason's voice, clipped and sharp. Breach teams moving. Confirmed primary entry clear. Sweep and secure. His tone had the flatness of a man who had learned mercy was not an operational parameter, it was an outcome. Vanessa's throat contracted. She had given them a window. Now she had to keep it open long enough for them to strip the compound of danger and gather the living. The courtyard was a mess of bodies and smoke. Smoke blurred shapes into suggestion. She tracked a movement to the east, a fighter stumbling with a grenade in hand, head turning toward the breach point. She adjusted her aim, calculated, breathed. The rifle answered like a muscle. The man fell and stopped moving. The grenade did not detonate. One small decision erased catastrophe. East ingress covered, she reported. One grenade threat neutralized. Continue breach. Her voice was thin with focus. The men below did not have the luxury of her distance. They had hands that could be cut and hearts that could be stopped in a heartbeat. She felt each of theirs like a vibration through the radio. The assault fractured the enemy's cohesion. Where ritual had once guided the Jackal's men, now chaos reigned. A handful ran, clutching wounds. Others sought the inner rooms, barricading doors. The SEALs moved like a wave, splitting to sweep rooms, to pry open closets of cruelty, to check every shadow for a pulse. She watched, breathed, and shot, not with the poetry of a legend but with the blunt arithmetic of necessity. A man raising to throw a satchel. A fighter ducking behind stacked crates with a rifle. Each elimination was a small mercy, a narrow avoidance of a larger calamity. And then the shout came that made her blood tilt. Hostages located, main building clear, secondary holding check, the radio filled with sharp, relieved bursts. The world leaned toward hope as men in fatigues pulled open doors and found living. Voices came through the fog of confusion, hoarse and incredulous. 12 alive, moving to extraction. The words landed in Vanessa's chest like small, hot stones. For a heartbeat she let herself feel something close to joy. But joy is a dangerous indulgence in war. It makes you careless. She clipped it back, refocusing. Her brother could be anywhere, among the dust, in a tucked corner in a room they hadn't checked yet. She had seen that look on men's faces before, the way fear laced with a stubbornness that made you refuse to disappear early. She did not know which face Michael would wear, only that she must find him before the valley closed like a fist. Secondary building still hot, Mason warned. Alleged isolated holding area, green room at rear, sweep now. The tone had the brittle edge of control. Someone was still missing. Someone still reached into the dark. Vanessa tracked the teams as they funneled through corridors. Her sight painted the interior in heat. Clusters where hostages lay, clusters where enemies tried to hide, a human tapestry of fear and survival. She flagged 2 operators as they moved into a stairwell, a flash and a shadow, and fired a suppressive pair that pinned them down long enough for entry. The stairwell became a throat. They choked it clean and moved on. Inside those rooms, the men and women pulling bodies into safety worked quickly. Hands practiced at the choreography of care. They checked for breathing, ripped at bindings, peeled away cloth to reveal faces that turned to them with the slow, unintended expression of those who had lived through the worst and still believed in rescue. Any sign of the isolated? Vanessa asked, voice tight. Working it, Mason replied. Alpha team on the green room. Static filled the space for a pace, then his voice returned. Found one. He's alive but injured. Mail about Reynolds. Reynolds is here. The name landed like an anvil. Her lungs forgot to function for a second. Which Reynolds? She asked before she could stop herself. Questions. Always the sterile things men ask to keep themselves from dissolving into chaos. Sergeant Major, no, Staff Sergeant Michael Reynolds, he's alive. The words might as well have been carved into her chest. Alive, injured, Michael. All at once the world narrowed and expanded. Focus sharpened until every sense vibrated with purpose. Where? Her voice was barely a thread. Move to extraction point. They're stabilizing him now. He's up, walking with support. We're making for LZ. Mason's voice was steady but threaded with relief. Move to rendezvous, Hawk. Rendezvous Alpha now. She disassembled and packed with the speed of someone whose hands had practiced this exact geometry. Each click of the rifle pieces echoed in her ears like a metronome of fate. Her legs moved before her head fully followed. Down the ridgeline. Down into the valley that still smelled of dust and smoke and the iron tang of adrenaline. Each step measured, sound stilled. The path back to the extraction point surged with new danger. Local fighters, stirred by the blast and the scent of blood, were already converging. The enemy knew trophies and revenge. They knew the value of striking wounded men at a landing zone. The SEALs moved Sherpa-like, carrying the fragile treasure of survivors through crag and shadow. Vanessa kept pace at the edge of the team, an invisible line of fire across the terrain, scanning for any movement that suggested ambush. When she reached the clearing, the sight hit her with something raw. The helicopters hovered above a swirl of dust and wounded breath. Operators worked like carpenters on a rushed build. Stretchers loaded, medical gear passed, hands steady with years of repetition. Litter after litter creaked into the Black Hawk's cavernous belly. And there he was, Michael, thinner, blood-dark bruises streaking his face like bad maps. He leaned on a SEAL's shoulder, fist closing and opening as if needing air, a human trying to remap his own balance. When his eyes found hers across the chaos, they widened. Then something like a painful, disbelieving smile tried to form. She moved to him faster than thought. The world narrowed to the seam where his ribs rose and fell. He looked older than the memory in her head. The interrogation had not been kind. Sweat and grime crusted his uniform. A black crescent of dried blood lined his temple, but the ribs rose, breath. He was alive. Michael, the name tore out of her like a prayer turned command. He blinked, trying to focus, then recognition hit and his face broke into a broken grin. Hawk. His voice was raw as cloth. You didn't, he stopped, the rest lost to the way the world had rearranged itself. She reached him, steadied him with an arm across his shoulders. He leaned against her as if the familiar weight of her body could anchor his brokenness. For a moment, sibling and savior blurred into the same role. He made a sound that was half laugh, half cry. She wanted to dissolve there and then, to let emotion sweep her away like a tide. She did not. There were still men to extract. There was still a helicopter to ride. There was still the quiet work of making sure everyone who had come home would make it past the valley. Don't talk, she ordered softly, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. Move, we get you medicked on the bird. Her hands were steady, her mouth clipped with that professional distance that had kept them both alive for years. He nodded, and for a second she caught the stubborn spark she'd always admired. You always were loudest with a rifle, he rasped, and their old banter skittered across the crack in his voice. She let herself crack a micro-smile, wonky humor in the worst times. It fit them. It was human. It anchored them to the life before the mission, instead of becoming swallowed in its violent teeth. Extraction was messy. The Blackhawks lifted, rotors throwing the valley into wind and dust. Local fighters appeared on the edges of visibility, scurrying like shadows finding shelter. Vanessa helped Michael into one of the birds, adjusting his harness, checking the medic's grip. He turned and looked at her once more, eyes wet, furious with gratitude, pride, and a world of other things. You were insane, he mouthed. It was the closest he'd come to praise in the moment, the kind that needed no applause. She climbed into the helicopter last, helmet clicking in place. Mason slid in opposite, nodding once. No need for fanfare. The bird lifted, leaving behind a valley that had been transformed by violence and courage. Behind them, the compound burned, black smoke twisting into the morning sky like a wound stitched shut but still raw. The flight toward safety gave them a suspended silence, not restful but reflective. Men exhaled. Some cried in private, some stared at nothing. Vanessa watched Michael sleep or rest, his chest rising in the chaotic rhythm of someone who had been through too much. She felt relief wash through her, a dangerous, beautiful flood that threatened to unbalance her. But relief was not safety. It was a pause, a place where grief could creep in and anchor itself. She leaned back against the helicopter wall and let herself feel the small, steady beat of Michael's presence. Determination tempered into gratitude. She had not only proved herself to commanders and skeptics, she had kept a promise not spoken aloud since he was a kid, that she would try to keep him safe. And yet the wound of the valley remained in the air. 12 men had been saved, 12 lives redirected toward morning. But for each life lifted, another story of loss or lasting injury sat like a shadow in a corner, waiting. War never lets you leave clean. Mason's voice came over the intercom, low enough for only those inside to hear. "Good work, everyone. Get medical debrief. We move." He did not say it like a celebration. He said it like the man who had watched life and death balance on his call and had chosen the side that kept people breathing. Beneath that terse professionalism, Vanessa's chest filled with a new, quieter thought. She had always measured herself by the shots she'd made, the lives she'd changed by a millimeter of choice. Today, she had done more than shoot. She, woven herself into a thread of lives rescued, a sister turned guardian, a teacher turned battlefield instrument. But even as the Blackhawks screamed north and the valley dropped away beneath them, she could not promise herself peace. There were medals to be awarded, paperwork to be filed, and ghosts to be counted. There would be questions, and there would be people who would refuse to see the whole truth. She knew this. She had been wearing that knowledge like armor since first she learned to steady her breath. For now, she allowed herself one small private victory. Michael was alive, and she had been the reason. She let the relief wash through her like a small, dangerous heat. Tomorrow, the world would ask for explanations. Tonight, she held her brother's hand and let the silence between them be enough. Why is survival never as clean as it looks in reports? The helicopter hummed with the sound of worn rotors, each beat pulling them farther from the valley's smoke. Inside, men sat slumped, their heads bowed under the weight of adrenaline leaving their blood. Some cradled their rifles as if afraid to let go. Others stared into space, eyes glassy with the shock of still being alive. Vanessa sat near the tail, her rifle laid across her lap. For once, she didn't look through a scope. She looked at Michael. He lay stretched out on the bench opposite her, oxygen mask pressed against his face by a medic's steady hand. His skin was waxy, bruises a map of someone else's cruelty. Yet his chest rose and fell. That simple rhythm, a breath, a pause, another breath, felt more precious than anything she had ever won in her life. His eyes cracked open briefly, finding her through the haze. He tried to smile, though the effort contorted into a wince. Still, the expression was unmistakable. "You came for me." Her throat tightened. She didn't speak. There were no words that could balance the ledger of what he had endured. All she could offer him was presence, the one thing he had been denied in captivity. Across from her, Mason sat silent, arms folded. He watched the hostages more than his men, as if waiting for the numbers to betray him, as if any second one of those survivors might slip away. Commanders carried ghosts differently. For them, ghosts weren't just memories. They were questions. Did I do enough? Did I make the right call? When his eyes flicked to Vanessa, there was no skepticism left. Only a hard respect, the kind that didn't need words. Hours later, the C-17 swallowed them again, lifting them back toward the world that would never know the valley's true story. In the quiet belly of the transport, the debrief began. It was less ceremony than interrogation, less gratitude than assessment. CIA liaison Sarah Blackwood spread satellite images across a folding table. Her voice was sharp, her questions sharper. Trajectory analysis confirms 2 simultaneous casualties in the courtyard. The Jackal and his lieutenant both neutralized. Who called the shot? Every head turned toward Vanessa. She didn't move, didn't blink. She only said, Overwatch, standard engagement. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Standard, the word carried suspicion, maybe awe. At nearly 1,900 meters, through cover, with hostages present. It was the shot available, Vanessa said evenly. Bill chuckled from his corner, arms crossed, eyes twinkling. She's being polite. What she pulled off tonight will end up in sniper schools as a legend. Hell, it'll get called impossible by anyone who's never met her. Mason didn't smile, but his voice carried weight. Impossible or not, it saved my men, and it kept 12 Americans breathing. Blackwood studied Vanessa for a long moment, then scribbled something into her report. Politics were a different battlefield, colder, more merciless. Vanessa had no patience for them. She let the silence swallow the question of glory. Michael's stretcher was shifted toward the medical bay at the staging base. Vanessa walked beside it, her stride matching the medic's, her hand brushing his arm. He stirred awake, his voice raw. "You came." She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "Of course I did." "I didn't think," his breath faltered, pain snatching the words. "Didn't think you'd risk it." Her jaw clenched. "I didn't risk it, I calculated it, I knew you'd hold on." He made a sound, half laugh, half groan. "Still bossing me around." His eyes flicked up at her, soft with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. "You shouldn't have had to do this." She swallowed hard, the desert's dryness in her throat. "None of us should have to, but here we are." The words sat heavy. He reached for her hand with weak fingers. She let him hold it. For once, she didn't pull away. The debrief continued into the night. Mason gave his account, precise, military, stripped of emotion. Blackwood cross-examined. Bill added commentary when details demanded it, his gravel voice sometimes sharp, sometimes protective of Vanessa. When it was her turn, Vanessa delivered her report with calm precision. Distances, targets, kills confirmed, threats eliminated. Every sentence was bone-dry, stripped of feeling, because feelings never made it into the official record. But when she stepped out into the cool night air, away from the sterile light of the tent, the feelings finally found her. She leaned against the wing of the C-17, head tilted toward the stars. Her chest ached with the weight of release. Tonight she had balanced on the knife's edge of skill and desperation. Tonight she had looked into a scope and chosen to gamble not just her reputation but her brother's life. And somehow, by some impossible grace, she had won. But winning in war never feels like winning. It feels like survival, and survival always comes with ghosts. Bill joined her quietly, offering a flask. She shook her head, but he pressed it into her hand anyway. "For the nerves," he said, "not for the taste." She took a sip. The burn steadied her. "You did it," he said softly. "I don't hand out that line lightly. You did it." She didn't answer at first. The stars blurred above her. Finally, she said, "I almost didn't breathe." He smiled faintly. "That's why you hit. You knew when not to." Silence stretched between them. "Michael's alive," she whispered. The words felt strange in her mouth, like a prayer she was afraid would vanish if spoken too loudly. Bill nodded. "Alive because of you." Her throat closed. She shook her head. "Alive because of everyone, Mason's men, the medics, even the damn CIA." Bill studied her. "You've never been good at taking credit." "Because credit doesn't bring anyone back." His eyes softened. "Maybe not, but it can keep the living alive longer. Don't dismiss what you gave tonight." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the horizon where the sky began to gray. Dawn again, but different from the one in the valley. Softer, safer. Inside, Michael slept under the hands of medics. Tubes in his veins, bandages wrapping bruises. She stood at his bedside for a long time, just listening to him breathe. When he stirred, his voice was fragile. "You always said dignity doesn't shout." She met his gaze, eyes glinting in the dim light. "It doesn't." "What does it do?" His lips cracked in a faint smile. She reached down, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead like she hadn't since they were kids. Her voice was steady, quiet, certain. It acts. Why did the applause sound louder than the gunfire? Weeks later, Vanessa stood in her dress uniform beneath the ornate ceiling of a Washington hall that smelled of waxed wood and politics. Rows of uniforms lined the seats. Cameras clicked. The Secretary of Defense stood at the podium, his voice carrying the careful weight of ceremony. A mission that will be remembered not only for its precision, but for the extraordinary courage of those who refused to leave Americans behind. Today, we honor those who acted with valor, and we recognize Captain Vanessa Reynolds, whose actions on Overwatch directly saved the lives of 12 hostages and a full SEAL team. Applause burst through the room like shrapnel. She stood still, her hands behind her back, her chin steady. A ribbon was pinned to her chest, another rectangle of color to add to the collection. She didn't flinch, but she also didn't feel the warmth that the moment seemed to demand. Medals were for history books. They didn't quiet the images that still woke her at night, the faces through the scope, the impossible geometry of one bullet through two men, the faint sound of Michael's broken laugh when she first reached him. When the cameras turned, she smiled, the kind of practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Later, in the quiet of a Pentagon hallway, Mason caught up with her. He wasn't in dress whites. He had slipped into a plain suit, his hair cropped short, his eyes as steady as ever. "You handled that room like a combat op," he said. She shrugged. "It's all performance, different uniforms, same theater." He nodded. For once, he didn't argue. His voice lowered. "You know they'll turn your shot into legend, right? Cadets will read about it in sniper school for the next 50 years. She met his gaze. "And they'll forget the 12 men who came home. They'll forget my brother." His mouth tightened. He understood. He always had. But he also knew the machine didn't run on understanding. It ran on stories, on legends, on names that could be polished into examples. "You don't get to choose how they tell it," he said softly. "No," she agreed, "but I get to choose what I carry." Michael's recovery was slow, painful, and full of silence. In the VA hospital, he relearned how to breathe without the weight of pain in every rib. He relearned how to trust sunlight after months in the dark. Vanessa visited every day she could, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. He hated pity, so she never offered it. Instead, she brought him books, small jokes, and long silences that carried more weight than words. Sometimes he spoke of captivity, fragmented stories about the Jackal's men, about the hunger, the fear. Other times he said nothing, and she respected that. One evening, as dusk fell through the blinds, he looked at her and whispered, "You're the reason I'm here." She shook her head. "No, you're here because you held on." But his eyes stayed on her, unblinking, stubborn. "No, because you didn't let me go." Her chest tightened. For once, she didn't argue. The media wanted her face. News anchors asked for interviews, talk shows called, documentaries pitched offers. "The woman who took the impossible shot," the headlines read. They made her into something she didn't recognize, a symbol. She refused them all. Instead, she retreated to the range. There, in the silence of steel plates ringing at 1,000 yards, she found something like clarity. The rifle still felt like part of her body. The breath control, the math, the patience, it was still hers. But the glory, that belonged to others now. She had no need for it. Bill visited once, leaning on his cane, his old notebook tucked under his arm. He watched her fire without a word, then said, "Funny thing about legends, you don't get to live them. They live you." She looked at him, sweat glinting on her brow. "What am I supposed to do with that?" He smiled faintly. "Decide whether you want to be remembered for the bullet you fired or the lives you saved." Command tried to use her, of course. Speeches at academies, recruiting posters, a tour of bases where she could inspire the next generation. She attended some because saying no was not an option in uniform. But when she spoke, she stripped the speeches of glamour. She didn't talk about kill counts. She didn't talk about legends. She talked about patience, about fear, about the way silence can feel like a weight pressing against your chest. She told cadets that dignity wasn't loud and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was choose restraint. Some listened. Some wanted stories of blood and bullets instead, but she didn't change her message. She never would. Months later, she sat on a porch overlooking the Virginia hills, the same hills where she had trained so many. Michael sat beside her, his ribs healed, his face still carrying the marks of captivity. They shared a beer in silence, the evening sun painting the land in gold. "You ever think about quitting?" he asked suddenly. She considered it every day. "And why don't you?" She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Because someone has to stand where others can't. Not because I want to, because I can." He nodded slowly, understanding in the way only family could. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy. For once, it felt like peace. The army would write its reports. The media would tell its stories. Cadets would whisper her name as myth. But for Vanessa, the truth lived in smaller things. The sound of her brothers breathing at night, the memory of 12 men stepping into daylight after the valley, the way Bill's old notebook still sat on her desk. She never needed her name carved into history. She never needed the applause or the medals. Because she knew something those halls in Washington would never fully grasp. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't beg for recognition. It doesn't shine under bright lights. Sometimes dignity simply acts and then walks quietly away. Why did peace feel so much heavier than war? Months had passed since the valley, but the echoes remained. Vanessa stood at the long range of the Advanced Sniper Training Center. Virginia hills spread before her, steel targets glowing faint in the morning haze. Students lay prone in neat rows, rifles pressed to cheeks, eyes locked on scopes. Their shots cracked across the valley, misses, hits, adjustments. She walked the line quietly as she always did, boots crunching, voice low but firm. "Exhale halfway. Hold. Let the rifle surprise you." She corrected grips, adjusted elbows, nodded when steel rang true. To them, she was more than an instructor now. She was the myth, the sniper who had made the impossible shot. But to herself, she was just a woman trying to teach them that patience mattered more than pride. Behind her, Bill leaned on his cane, a faint smile tugging his lips. "Funny thing," he said, "I remember when you were the one lying in that dirt, fighting the urge to blink too fast." She glanced at him. His hair was whiter, his shoulders more stooped, but his eyes were still sharp. "And you were the one telling me not to overthink wind drift." He chuckled. "And now they'll remember you, not me." She shook her head. "They'll remember the shot, not the woman." "That's enough," he said simply. "Legends aren't about names. They're about what people carry forward." His words lingered as the line fired again, the valley filling with pings and echoes. Later in her office, she found Michael sitting on the edge of her desk, nursing a coffee. His recovery had been steady. Scars lined his arms, but his posture was strong again. "You look tired," he said. "I teach 20 students at a time how not to kill themselves with a rifle. I'm always tired." He smirked, still bossy. "Still breathing," she countered. Their eyes held, a silent exchange that carried months of unspoken words. He finally said, softer, "You saved me." She shook her head. "We saved you. Mason, his men, Bill, me." "But it was your bullet." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Mason visited once, weeks later. Not in uniform. Just jeans, a jacket, his hair more silver than she remembered. They walked the range together in silence. "You know," he said finally, "I've been asked to give talks about the operation. They want me to explain how it worked." "And?" she asked. He shrugged. "I told them it worked because someone took a shot no one else would dare take." His eyes flicked to her. "I didn't say your name. I figured you wouldn't want it." "You figured right." He studied her a moment, then said, You know, Hawk, I've served with a lot of shooters. Good ones, great ones, but you're different. You don't chase the kill, you carry it. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Somebody has to. They stood in silence, the range alive with distant cracks. Mason finally offered his hand. She shook it, firm and brief. That was enough. At night, the ghost still came. She dreamed of the Jackal's one eye, of Michael's bruised face, of the moment when her finger rested on the trigger and the whole world balanced on the edge of a breath. She woke sometimes drenched in sweat, heart hammering. But she also dreamed of quieter things. Of Michael's laugh when he teased her, of Bill's crooked smile, of Mason's grudging respect, of cadets ringing steel and turning with wide-eyed pride when she nodded. Both dreams lived in her, both would stay. One evening she walked the hills alone. The sun dipped low, painting the fields in amber. She carried no rifle, just herself, her boots crunching on familiar dirt. She thought of everything that had brought her here, the doubters, the whispers, the broken nights in Afghanistan, the impossible shot, the medal pinned on her chest that now sat in a drawer she never opened. She thought of Michael, alive and whole. She thought of Bill, whose notebook still lay on her desk, filled with wisdom she hadn't yet finished reading. She thought of Mason's men, who had gone home to families because one bullet had found its path. She paused at the crest of a hill, looking out across the valley. The same valley where cadets fired, where echoes carried, where the next generation was already learning patience, silence, dignity. And she realized something she hadn't before. It was never about the shot. Not really. Not the impossible bullet, not the applause, not the legend. It was about what came after, about choosing to keep walking, to keep teaching, to keep carrying the ghosts without letting them consume you. She drew in a slow breath, let it out, and whispered to the wind, not as a prayer, not as a confession, but as a truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't wait for credit. It doesn't shine under medals or lights. Sometimes dignity simply acts, and then it walks away. The hills carried her words like echoes, and then, like her, they fell silent.